everybody, this is Lannis from the Leslie Science and Nature Center and the Ann Arbor Hands-On Museum. Today we're going to take you guys on a virtual hike through one of our favorite spaces here within Washtenaw County, and that's Black Pond Woods. Through all of the virtual hikes or mini hikes that we do with you guys over a video screen, we'll make sure to take stops along the way and check out cool things that you can discover either right at home or if you ever get the chance to come out on this hike on your own. We'll take a look at common Michigan native species that we find here within Washtenaw County, as well as try to discover something new on each hike that we go on. We'll also make sure to include some fun facts, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. It's a beautiful spring day, just a little cloudy, but still lots of vibrant life, as you can hear behind me going on. So let's see if we can take a closer look at what we can find here in Black Pond Woods. Let's go. Now, for today's hike, you'll notice that there's a couple different trails that we can take when we go through Black Pond Woods. Today, we're going to be following the black arrows. So when you see any of the trailheads in the video, note that we're following typically the black arrow up on the very top. Usually helps to signify that that's the trail that takes you to Black Pond, which we'll discover when we get closer. Also worth noting though that there are a couple other smaller hikes. You can see a blue, red, and even green trail that are about half the size or half the distance than the Black Pond Trail is. All of these trails though are just under a mile, and while there's a little bit of an elevation change, are relatively easy to walk through. Alright, let's go, let's keep exploring. Now, one of the most interesting things about going on a hike on this trail is the drastic change in the landscape and the habitat as you walk from what feels more like a prairie into an old growth forest or more of a woodland space. Around me, and I'll kind of rotate a little bit, you can see that there's quite a few large trees. We're in an oak hickory forest primarily, but at least in the beginning of the video, almost no trees were this size, this age, or at least of the species. It felt much more open in almost like a prairie setting. Well, that can tell you a lot about the history of the land. Part of the land here in Black Pond Woods actually used to be agricultural land or farmland, to where once that business stopped, the landscape was able to become more naturalized, if you will. However, it can be theorized then that this really old woodland space was untouched or hardly used for man-made purposes. That allowed these tree species to get to grow to be larger, live longer, or develop new tree species that we didn't see at the beginning of the hike. The elevation changes too can also signal a little bit of the glacial history behind this area, whether it's not different glaciers that developed the hillsides, the changes in the hilly elevation, or one of the big, more wetland features we're going to see soon. Either way, a lot of cool things to think about and really cool scenery to discover as it changes throughout our hike. Let's keep going. If you've met any of the staff members that work at the Leslie Science Nature Center, or really anybody that's taken a guided hike through this woods, everybody stops by this tree. Now, as you're walking through, we're getting pretty close to the black pond itself. You'll notice that there's a couple, let's call it artwork, if you will, around the tree section here. And what you're noticing is evidence of a bird that we call a yellow-bellied sapsucker. Now the cool thing is that you can see it's almost in a line or circular pattern around the tree. That's because these guys are actually looking for insects and probing into the bark of this tree, searching for some delicious, well, insect snacks. A little different than woodpecker holes, which are not only a lot wider, but are kind of sporadically all throughout the tree, also a little higher up. If you pass by this tree on the hike, you'll see it almost looks like a spiral pattern as it goes up and up further near the top end of the tree, the canopy, if you will. So a really cool stop to talk about or interpret some of the species that we might find here in Black Pond Woods. All right, let's keep walking. Okay, we've made it. The big feature of this trail, Black Pond. Now, the name Black Pond, or the black color that you see, isn't just because somebody dyed the color black. The kind of pond that we're floating on here on the bridge is what we call a vernal pool, or a vernal pond. What that means is that there's really only water in this space 3 out of 4 of the main seasons. There's no flowing, moving body of water that comes in to supply water in this bowl-shaped area all year round. That also means that fish can't survive in this space. There just isn't any water. So what that then means is that other animals like amphibians or insects we call macroinvertebrates thrive in this kind of habitat. This is where their big breeding grounds are, or where they migrate to in the spring to lay their eggs and mate. Now, it's also pretty quiet in this pond right now. Usually around the spring season, it's the end of March here in Michigan, you'll hear tons of different kinds of frog calls. Spring peepers, green frogs, wood frogs, you name it. It's still in the morning, so sometimes it's a little earlier for that, and it's about 41 degrees, so it's a little chilly for these guys to be active and out. But once the temperature warms up, sometimes you can't even hear me talk because the frogs are just too loud. However, we still have a thriving population of different kinds of birds. You guys can see the pair of mallard ducks that's behind me in this pond. Every so often we'll find turtles. There's a couple woodpeckers that are making a lot of noise, blue jays, chickadees, you name it. So even though the frogs aren't out, there's still a lot to see. Now this black color comes from the tannins that are in the leaves that fall here in this space. We said in the beginning this is a oak hickory forest, and most of the leaves that we're seeing on the trail are oak leaves. They typically fall last in the fall. So what happens then is that if they get into the water, the tannins, or the dye, if you will, from the leaves soaks out of the leaves into the water, giving it this kind of murky tint, if you will. Great camouflage though for those amphibians and more, especially as we humans are walking by. We'll go ahead and hang out here in the pond a little bit more, and then we'll continue to the rest of our hike. Now, coming into this forest and looking at what's around you, you have to do a little bit of tree ID. It's only appropriate if you're going on something like a winter hike. Mostly because how we typically identify trees is by looking at their leaves. But in the winter and spring, can't usually do that because the leaves aren't on all the trees. So how I learned to interpret or identify at least some of the common trees here in Michigan is by using something we call the 3 Bs, which is their branches, their buds, and their bark. Now a lot of these trees are pretty old, so it'd be hard to go up to actually be able to see their buds as well as some of their branches. So for now we'll just focus on bark. In an oak hickory forest, obviously you're going to have mostly oak types or hickory trees. Behind me here is actually a red oak. The way I like to describe how its bark looks is actually that it looks like it's giant chunks or strips of its bark that got plastered or paper mache, you could even say ironed onto this ginormous tree trunk. Not to be confused with ironwood, which sometimes has that same description. Sometimes though too, for oak trees, these guys, even when their leaves die, they actually keep their leaves on their branches through the winter. They'll be dried up and they don't work anymore, or sometimes they just fall last. So if you see a deciduous tree, or a tree that typically loses its leaves, that still has some of its leaves hanging from the branches even in the winter time, it's often sometimes known to be an oak. Red or white oaks are the most common that we have. And then if we walk this way a little bit, there's a great representation of the common hickory tree we have in this forest called a shagbark hickory. And as you imagine, the bark looks, well, a bit shaggy. These open-ended strips flailing outwards along the bark here in the trunk, and it goes all the way up to the top. Basically, it looks like somebody tried to comb this tree, and it has a bunch of split ends on the edge too. And you'll see that in shagbark hickory, it's really prominent. Their leaves do obviously look different than an oak, as well as their buds and where their branches are, but I like to look at the bark primarily to be able to tell these two apart. So this is what you see most often on this trail. Now, other trees you might find in here are black walnut, black cherry, sometimes musclewood or beech trees, but because these species are so prominent and we usually see them together in certain forests, that's how we classify this as an oak hickory forest. Here, we can go see if we can discover some more of those types of trees on our walk. one of the things about doing these virtual hikes is that while I'm out here alone and it's very peaceful and quiet, it forces me as an interpreter or a naturalist to really pay attention to my surroundings. Like many, I love to go on walks and I like to go discover new things, but I too miss some of the details or the really interesting parts of a woods, even if I've walked it hundreds of times. So while I hope many of you that are watching this are enjoying the hikes, it's really exciting for me because it's making me see all these really cool, intriguing details and differences of things that we find here on our hike. So it's exciting both as a teacher and just a nature lover too, which hopefully is for you guys as well. So we find something interesting down here. Doesn't look like much, but some of the plants that you are noticing is a highly invasive flowering plant that we have here called garlic mustard. It's almost sometimes people think it looks like an ivy, but from down here it's this little plant right here. Now there's an organization called Natural Area Preservation that does a lot of invasive species polls and management in this woods, and so I bet they'll be out this year to help take care of the species that we find. But interesting thing about garlic mustard is if you take a leaf, I'm not as concerned about taking a leaf from this plant because I don't really want it here in the woods anyway, and if you scrunch it around in your fingers and you smell your fingers, it smells, obviously, just like garlic. But the really cool thing is that there's actually cookbooks out there for how people can take invasive species and use them in their meals. For this plant, just out of personal note, it's great in your mashed potatoes. So if you know that it hasn't been sprayed or doesn't have any kind of chemicals on it to get rid of it, and you ever find a patch or so near your garden or by your backyard, pick a bit, put it in your mashed potatoes, and see what kind of flavors you come up with. All right, we'll keep going. I bet we'll find more along our hike. Well, we've made it to the end of our Black Pond Woods Black Trail Loop here within our grounds in Washtenaw County. It looks like a great picnic spot out here today, and we got some live birds of prey that are housed on this space that I might go check out in a little bit. But from there, since this concludes our virtual hike, always feel free to reach out if you have any questions about what you saw on the trail or anything more about the history of the space. We also hope that you guys enjoyed the virtual tour here too. If you have any parks or areas around your space that you want to learn more about, or have us go on a hike with to see if we can find any cool, interesting things about the outdoor world there, reach out and let us know. From there, we hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and happy hiking, everybody!